rancher rented
Look,
a house
I
for
didn't
one
want it to
night,
come to this,
but
but
found out an Apache
staying
woman
here
had been
isn't safe
hiding there for
anymore.
weeks. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the jagged hills of Arizona, painting the sky with shades of orange, pink, and purple. He was tired from riding his old horse across rough terrain, checking on his cattle, and making sure everything on his ranch was in order. His ranch lay miles away from the nearest town, and after a long day, John was eager for a place where he could rest and regain some energy. He had heard of a small house for rent along the desert road. It was modest, old, and isolated, but that was exactly what he wanted, a quiet place with no distractions. The house stood on the edge of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by dry brush and scattered desert rocks. From a distance it looked abandoned, but as he got closer, he noticed that it was well kept, at least from the outside. The paint was peeling in a few places, and the wooden fence creaked slightly in the evening breeze. A single window reflected the colors of the sunset, and the small front porch looked inviting, despite its worn appearance. John parked his horse near the fence and stepped down, feeling the warm dust crunch beneath his boots. As he approached the door, he glanced around, noticing the silence of the desert. There were no other houses nearby, no sounds of animals except for the occasional call of a distant bird and the wind rustling through the dry grass. The isolation was comforting to him. He liked the solitude that came with the desert. There was something peaceful about being alone, away from the constant demands of life back at his ranch. John unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of dust and wood, a scent that reminded him of his grandfather's old cabin from years ago. The interior was simple, one small living room, a kitchen, and a single bedroom. A thin layer of dust covered the furniture, and a few cobwebs hung in the corners. It was clear no one had been staying there for a while. He dropped his bag near the couch and ran a hand over the surface, feeling the fine dust cling to his fingers. He moved toward the kitchen to get a drink of water. The faucet worked, though the water smelled slightly metallic. He poured a cup, drank slowly, and leaned against the sink, letting the cool water wash away some of the weariness from his long journey. As he looked around, he noticed small signs that seemed unusual. A plate on the counter had crumbs that appeared fresh. The stove had a pot with a faint residue inside, as if someone had used it recently. At first, he thought perhaps the previous renter had left in a hurry, but something about it didn't feel right. As John walked back into the living room, he noticed a shadow move across the hallway leading to the back of the house. He stopped immediately, his instincts alert. The desert had taught him to be cautious, and he knew that sudden noises or movements in an empty house could mean someone or something was there. He took a deep breath and called out in a calm, steady voice, "Hello, is someone there?" There was no response. Only the faint creak of the floorboards answered him. John's hand moved toward the pocket of his jacket, where he kept a small flashlight. He switched it on and slowly walked toward the hallway. The beam of light cut through the dim interior, and for a moment all he saw was the plain wooden door leading to what seemed like the back room. Then he saw her. She was sitting in the corner of the room, partially hidden behind an old curtain. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she pulled her knees close to her chest. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with long dark hair that fell messily over her shoulders. Her clothes were simple and worn, and her face, though striking, bore the marks of weeks without proper rest or food. She looked up at him with a mix of shock and caution. John froze, not wanting to startle her further. He slowly lowered the flashlight, keeping his hands visible. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently. "My name is John. I rented this house for the night. Who are you?" The woman's voice was barely audible. "Please, I don't want trouble." She stayed in the corner, her eyes darting toward the door as if planning an escape. John could see she was trembling. His heart went out to her. There was something in her eyes that spoke of fear and resilience at the same time. He realized that this was not a casual encounter. She had been hiding here for a reason. Over the next few minutes, John tried to make her feel safe. He spoke calmly, explaining that he meant no harm and that she could trust him, at least for the moment. Slowly, she began to relax, though she did not move from her corner. She introduced herself as Nahel. She said little at first, only enough to answer John's questions about her presence in the house. As John listened, he began to piece together her story. Nahel was an Apache woman who had been hiding in the desert for weeks. She had fled from danger, from people who wanted to take her away from her family and her land. She had survived on small supplies, avoiding contact with anyone who might bring harm. Her journey had been difficult. She had walked for miles through rough terrain, finding shelter where she could. The house had been a temporary refuge, a place where she could rest without being discovered. John could hardly imagine the life she had endured. The desert was unforgiving, and surviving alone required courage, skill, and determination. He felt a mix of awe and concern. Here was someone who had faced unimaginable challenges, and yet she was still alive, still fighting. He offered her some water and a small meal he had brought with him, and after some hesitation she accepted. She ate slowly, her hands shaking slightly, but John could see the relief in her eyes. While she ate, John looked around the house more carefully. He noticed small signs that Nahel had been living here for some time. There were makeshift bedding areas, remnants of food, and small fire pits where she had heated water. It was clear that she had been careful, leaving little trace, but the evidence was there for someone observant enough to notice. John realized that this woman had been surviving in secrecy, relying on her wits and courage. As the evening passed, John and Nahel talked quietly. She shared more of her story, though still carefully. She spoke of her family, of the land that had been taken from her people, and of the dangers she had faced along the way. John listened, feeling a deep respect for her resilience. He had grown up hearing stories of the hardships faced by native communities, but hearing it from someone who had lived through it was entirely different. It was raw, real, and deeply moving. The night grew darker, and the wind outside picked up, rustling the dry brush and carrying the scent of the desert. John felt a strange mix of calm and tension. The house, which had seemed so simple and quiet, now felt alive with stories, with history, and with the presence of someone who had endured so much. He realized that his simple plan of spending one night in a rented house had turned into something far more profound, a chance encounter with courage and survival. By the time he settled into the small bedroom, John could not stop thinking about Nahel. He understood that she had been living in constant fear, yet she had survived on her own. The thought was both humbling and inspiring. He knew that the next hours would be quiet, but he also knew that his life had already been changed by this meeting. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly under the starlit sky. The silence was deep, but inside the small house, the quiet was filled with understanding, trust, and a shared humanity. John realized that sometimes life had a way of bringing people together in unexpected ways. A simple rental, a quiet evening, and the desert had created a moment that neither of them would ever forget. The morning sun peeked over the jagged desert hills, casting long shadows across the dusty landscape. John Miller woke to the faint sound of wind whispering through the cracks in the old house. He stretched and rubbed his eyes, still thinking about the night before and the unexpected visitor who had changed the quiet rhythm of his day. Nahel, the young Apache woman, was already awake. She had moved quietly, sitting near the small window and looking outside. Her eyes followed the path of a lone hawk circling high above the desert. John got up, careful not to make any sudden noises. He wanted to respect her space. He brewed a small pot of coffee and carried it to the living room where she sat. She glanced at him but did not speak immediately. Instead, she accepted the mug with a soft nod and a quiet thank you. John noticed the faint tremor in her hands as she held the cup. It was clear that the fear she had lived with for weeks had not yet left her. They sat in silence for a few minutes. John knew he had to break it gently if he wanted to understand her story. "Nahel," he began softly, "you don't have to tell me anything you're not ready for, but if you want to, I can listen. I want to understand why you've been here alone." Nahel took a deep breath, her dark eyes meeting his. There was hesitation, a moment of calculation as if weighing trust against the risk of speaking. Finally, she began. Her voice was low but steady. She told John that her family had lived on land near the desert for generations. Her people had been proud, skilled in survival, and deeply connected to the land. But as settlers and authorities expanded into the area, her family faced increasing threats. They were forced from their home, their land taken, and their lives disrupted. She had escaped during one of these forced removals. Her family had been separated in the chaos, and she had run into the desert, unsure of where she would go or how she would survive. For weeks she had moved quietly, avoiding anyone who might notice her. She scavenged for food, collected water from small springs, and found shelter wherever she could. She had learned to live without comfort, without company, and without hope of immediate rescue. Her survival had depended on her skills, her intelligence, and her courage. John listened intently, feeling a mixture of awe and sorrow. He could not imagine the fear she had faced, walking alone through the desert with only the sun and the wind as companions. He felt a deep empathy for her struggles and an urge to protect her from any further harm. Yet, he knew the situation was complicated. There were laws, people looking for her, and dangers beyond what he could see. For now, all he could do was offer kindness and shelter. He offered her a simple breakfast of bread, dried fruit, and some coffee. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she could trust him completely. But hunger and exhaustion overcame caution, and she accepted. As they ate, John asked gentle questions about her journey. She spoke of the nights spent under the open sky, where the stars were the only company. She described the days of walking through rugged terrain, climbing rocks, and avoiding areas where people might be. Every word painted a picture of resilience and determination. John began to see the depth of her resourcefulness. She explained how she had learned to find edible plants, how to track water sources, and even how to read the signs of animals to avoid danger. Her knowledge of the land was impressive. A mix of inherited wisdom and practical survival skills she had sharpened in her desperate circumstances. John realized that this young woman was not just surviving, she was thriving in a way that required courage, intelligence, and adaptability. As the morning passed, their conversation shifted to lighter topics. Nahel, though wary, began to share small stories of her childhood, days spent learning traditional crafts, playing near streams, and listening to elders' stories. John listened with a growing sense of admiration. He could see the strength in her spirit and the depth of her connection to her heritage. He realized that the challenges she had faced had not broken her, they had shaped her into someone extraordinary. Despite the growing trust between them, tension remained. John knew that the desert was not entirely safe. Neighbors occasionally passed through, and there were always authorities searching for people who had fled from forced removals. He had to be careful, not just for himself, but for Nahel. He suggested they remain inside for most of the day, moving only when necessary. She agreed, understanding the caution required to avoid being seen. During the quiet hours, John began to think about his own life in comparison. He had grown up on a ranch, familiar with the challenges of work and weather, but he had never faced the fear of being hunted or displaced. He had never had to survive completely alone. Listening to Nahel's story made him reflect on the privileges and stability he often took for granted. He felt grateful for his life, but also deeply moved by her courage. In the afternoon, John decided to help Nahel in practical ways. He gathered some supplies he had in his pack, extra water, blankets, and non-perishable food, and arranged them carefully for her use. She watched quietly, her expression unreadable at first, then softened with gratitude. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small measure of safety. John did not press her to talk further, understanding that trust needed time. His respect for her space allowed her to feel some control in a situation that had been dominated by fear and uncertainty for too long. Over the next few hours, they shared more than conversation. They shared routines. John tended to chores around the small property, checking doors and windows and making sure the house was secure. Nahel moved quietly, helping where she could, her presence calming rather than intrusive. The two of them, strangers only a day before, began to form a quiet partnership, built on trust, respect, and mutual understanding. John was also struck by her resilience in small, daily ways. She organized her belongings with care, kept the space tidy, and even found small tasks to do around the house. Her attention to detail and her ability to remain composed despite her exhaustion were impressive. John realized that she had survived not just through instinct, but through thoughtful planning and determination. Every small action she took was a testament to her strength. As the sun began to set, the desert transformed. Shadows grew long, and the air cooled, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and desert plants. John and Nahel sat near the window, watching the changing colors of the sky. They spoke quietly about the past and the future, about survival, hope, and the world outside the desert. John could see a flicker of relief in her eyes, a small sense of comfort that had been missing for weeks. Even as they shared this quiet moment, John remained aware of the risks. He knew that she could not stay hidden forever, and that their temporary safety depended on caution and secrecy. But for now, the house was a haven, and their shared presence provided a sense of security. John felt proud that he could help, and Nahel, in turn, seemed to find reassurance in his calm and steady demeanor. That night, as darkness enveloped the desert, John reflected on the extraordinary turn his day had taken. He had arrived at the house seeking only rest and solitude, but he had found a story of courage, survival, and resilience. Nahel's experiences had opened his eyes to a world of struggle and strength that he had never fully understood. He realized that the desert, harsh as it was, had shaped her into a remarkable young woman, capable of facing danger and uncertainty with grace and determination. Before going to sleep, John made a silent promise to protect Nahel as best as he could. He would ensure that she remained safe, at least while she stayed in the house. He also knew that he had much to learn from her, not just about survival, but about courage, patience, and the human spirit. The encounter had already changed him, leaving a lasting impression that he knew would stay with him long after the desert faded from view. Outside, the stars filled the sky, brilliant and endless. The desert was quiet, but within the small house, a sense of understanding and trust had grown. John and Nahel, two strangers from very different worlds, had found a shared connection in the most unlikely of places. And as sleep finally claimed him, John felt a deep sense of respect for the young woman who had endured so much and a quiet hope that together, they could navigate the dangers of the days ahead. The next morning, John woke to the soft glow of sunlight spilling through the cracks in the old wooden blinds. The desert outside was alive with the quiet sounds of early morning, birds calling in the distance, the rustle of dry grass in the wind, and the faint hum of insects beginning their day. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from the long ride and the sleepless nights he had endured on his ranch. But his mind was not on his own fatigue. It was on Nahel, who had spent countless days surviving alone in this unforgiving land. Nahel was already awake, her dark eyes scanning the horizon from the small window near the kitchen. She seemed calm, almost at ease, but John knew better. He had seen the wariness in her eyes, the careful way she had moved through the house. The months of hiding and evading danger had left marks that went beyond physical exhaustion. They were written in her posture, her gaze, and her silence. She was strong, yes, but the weight of weeks spent alone in constant fear was evident. John prepared a simple breakfast of eggs and bread, adding a little butter from the small supply he had brought with him. He carried the plate to the table where Nahel had set herself up near the window. She accepted the meal with a quiet nod, her hands steady now but still careful. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice carried a tone of trust, and John felt a flicker of relief. It was a small sign that their uneasy alliance was slowly growing into something more genuine, a bond built on mutual respect and understanding. After breakfast, John suggested that they step outside for a while. The desert, despite its harshness, offered lessons that could not be learned inside the four walls of the house. He wanted to understand how Nahel had managed to survive alone, to learn from her experiences, and perhaps to share a little of his own knowledge of the land. She hesitated at first, glancing around as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows, but finally she agreed. The sun was higher now, and the heat of the day began to creep across the desert floor. John and Nahel walked carefully, choosing a path that avoided the main dirt road. She moved gracefully, almost as if she were part of the land itself, her steps quiet and measured. John tried to mimic her careful movements, noticing how her eyes scanned the horizon, how she listened to the wind, and how she read the signs of animals and plants around them. It was a skill that came naturally to her, but required focus and practice for anyone else. As they walked, Nahel began to explain some of the basic survival techniques she had relied on for weeks. She pointed out a small cluster of desert plants and showed John which were safe to eat and which could make him sick. She taught him how to find hidden water sources, hidden beneath rocks or in shallow pits, and how to collect rainwater when it was available. John listened intently, impressed by the depth of her knowledge and the precision with which she demonstrated each skill. He realized that she had survived not just by instinct, but by careful observation, planning, and intelligence. They came to a shallow depression in the ground, where Nahel explained how she had once built a temporary shelter using branches, stones, and desert brush. She described the nights spent inside, listening to the wind howl and the distant sounds of animals. John could imagine the isolation, the fear, and the determination it must have taken to endure each night alone. He felt a deep respect for her resilience and a growing admiration for the way she faced life without surrendering to despair. For hours, they moved together through the desert, John learning and Nahel teaching. She demonstrated how to track animals by their footprints, how to predict weather changes by observing the sky and the behavior of birds, and even how to move silently to avoid drawing attention. John tried to absorb every detail, realizing that he was not only learning survival skills but also gaining insight into her world, a world shaped by danger, displacement, and courage. During a brief pause in the shade of a rocky outcrop, John asked Nahel about her family. She spoke with a quiet sadness, telling him about the forced removals and the separation from those she loved. Her voice trembled slightly as she recounted moments of fear and loss, yet there was also a sense of pride in her tone. She had survived. She had endured. And she continued to hold the memory of her family and her heritage close to her heart. John felt a pang of sorrow but also a surge of admiration. She was more than a survivor. She was a living testament to strength and endurance. As the day progressed, John began to notice small changes in Nahel. She seemed more relaxed in his presence, more willing to share not just survival skills but stories of her life, her culture, and the lessons she had learned. He, in turn, shared details of his own life, his ranch, his family, and the challenges of managing the land. There was a quiet mutual respect between them, an unspoken understanding that they were different in many ways, but connected through their shared experience of the desert and the trust that was forming between them. Late in the afternoon, as the sun dipped lower, they returned to the small house. John noticed how Nahel moved with ease inside the space, arranging the small belongings she had made for herself, cleaning the areas she had used, and preparing for the night ahead. He admired her ability to create order and comfort in a place that was otherwise sparse and unfamiliar. Her strength was not just in survival. It was in her ability to maintain dignity and structure despite the chaos around her. That evening, they shared a simple meal together in the dim light of the house. The silence was comfortable now, filled with the quiet bond they had formed over the day's lessons and stories. John reflected on the extraordinary turn his journey had taken, from arriving at the house for a single night to becoming part of an ongoing story of survival and trust. He realized that Nahel's presence had changed him. He saw the desert differently now, not just as a harsh and unforgiving place, but as a landscape that shaped character, tested courage, and revealed resilience. As night fell, John and Nahel sat by the small window, looking out at the stars that seemed brighter and closer in the desert sky. The air was cooler, carrying the scent of dry earth and desert plants. John felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that they had made it through the day safely. He also knew that the challenges were far from over. Nahel could not stay hidden forever, and the desert, though beautiful, was full of dangers that required constant vigilance. Before going to sleep, John and Nahel shared a few more words. She thanked him for his kindness and for providing a safe space, even if only temporary. John reassured her that she could continue to rely on him, at least while she stayed in the house. There was a mutual understanding in their exchange, a recognition that trust had been built, but that caution was still necessary. That night, as John lay in bed, he reflected on the lessons he had learned. Nahel had shown him courage, resourcefulness, and the ability to survive under conditions he could scarcely imagine. Her strength was inspiring, and he felt a deep sense of responsibility to ensure her safety. He realized that their encounter was more than coincidence. It was an opportunity to witness the resilience of the human spirit, and to learn from someone who had endured so much with grace and determination. Outside, the desert was quiet under the starlit sky, but inside the house, there was a growing sense of partnership and understanding. John and Nahel, two individuals from very different worlds, had found common ground in trust, respect, and shared humanity. The day had been filled with lessons, not just about survival, but about empathy, courage, and the power of connection. As sleep claimed them, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the days ahead would bring challenges, but he also knew that together, they could face them. Nahel's presence had transformed a simple night's stay into a profound experience, one that would leave a lasting impression on him and shape the way he viewed the world, the desert, and the strength of those who survive against all odds. The days stretched on, and the desert seemed to slow in its movements. The sun rose earlier now, bathing the land in golden light that turned the sand and rock into an endless ocean of warmth. John and Nahel continued their daily routines, though the unease of their situation was never far from either of their minds. John had grown used to the quiet companionship that had developed between them, but he knew the time was approaching when Nahel could no longer stay in the house. They had been careful to avoid drawing attention, but the world outside the desert was vast, and its dangers were always present. For Nahel, the days in the house had been a brief reprieve, a quiet moment in a life that had been anything but peaceful. She had learned to find solace in the simple acts of daily living, preparing meals, tending to small tasks, and sharing stories with John. But as much as she appreciated the shelter he provided, she knew that the risks of staying hidden were growing. Every passing day increased the chance that someone would come looking for her. The authorities, the settlers, or even others with less noble intentions. She couldn't hide forever. On the morning of the fourth week, John woke early, as he often did, but this morning felt different. The air seemed thicker, the stillness in the house more pronounced. He knew it was time. They could not remain hidden forever. The desert, though vast and full of secrets, could not keep them safe indefinitely. Nahel had made her peace with this, and so had John. He found her standing near the window, her eyes scanning the horizon as they always did in the early mornings. She was silent, as if sensing the change in the air. John approached her, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. "It's time to go," he said quietly. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of the decision. There was no anger, no regret in his words, only the recognition of reality. Nahel turned to him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then her lips parted slightly and she nodded. She had known this day would come. "I know," she said, her voice soft but firm. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was thick with unspoken thoughts, about what would happen next, about the dangers that lay ahead, and about the bond they had formed in the short time they had spent together. John had never expected his life to take this turn. He had come to the desert for solitude, but instead, he had found something far more profound. He had found a story of survival, courage, and human connection that had deeply affected him. John had tried not to think about the future. He had wanted to help Nahel as much as he could, offering her shelter, a place to rest, and perhaps most importantly, the respect and empathy she had not often received. But the time had come to face reality, and he knew he could no longer keep her hidden. "We'll find a way," John said, his voice more resolute than he felt. He was not entirely sure how they would manage, but he couldn't leave her to face the world alone again. He would help her find a new place, a safer place where she could live freely without fear of being discovered. Nahel gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't just for the house or the food or the comfort of the past few weeks. It was for his kindness, his willingness to understand her pain, and his decision to stand by her despite the risks. After a brief breakfast, they packed their things. It was a quiet process. There was no rushing, no words of farewell, just the steady movement of two people preparing for an uncertain future. Nahel gathered the small belongings she had managed to collect over the weeks, and John helped her with the last of his supplies, ensuring she would have what she needed to continue her journey. When everything was ready, they stood outside for a moment, facing the desert once more. The house, which had been their temporary sanctuary, now felt like a distant memory, a place that had held both peace and tension in equal measure. John glanced at Nahel, who was standing beside him, her expression calm but focused. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Nahel nodded. "I will be." With that, they set out together, moving carefully along a path that would take them away from the house and further into the desert. John had no clear destination in mind. He didn't know where they would go or how they would survive the next days. But he knew they couldn't stay in the house any longer. There were other ways to survive, other places to seek refuge. As they walked, the silence between them felt different now. It was no longer uncomfortable or tense, but filled with a quiet understanding. John had grown to respect Nahel in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering connection to the land had taught him more than he could have ever imagined. And though he had helped her, he had also learned from her. In a way, they had both been teachers. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a vast and untamed expanse. John had known it for years, had walked its paths and studied its terrain, but this was different now. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was someone who had shared a deeply human experience with another person. He had learned what it meant to truly see someone, to understand their pain, and to stand beside them in the face of hardship. As they moved deeper into the desert, the heat of the day began to settle in, and the distant hills shimmered in the midday sun. John kept a steady pace, glancing back occasionally to make sure Nahel was keeping up. She moved with quiet determination, her steps sure and confident despite the weight of what lay ahead. For several hours they walked in silence, the vastness of the desert around them both comforting and unnerving. The sky above was a brilliant blue, but there were no clouds in sight, and the sun blazed relentlessly. John felt the heat on his skin, but it wasn't uncomfortable, not in the way it had been when he first arrived in the desert. Now it was familiar, even a little reassuring. As they stopped to rest under a large rock formation, John couldn't help but think of the countless others who had faced similar challenges. Nahel's story was not unique. It was part of a long history of displacement, survival, and perseverance. The more he learned, the more he understood how much he had taken for granted. The world outside the desert was full of stories like Nahel's, stories of people who had lived through hardships unimaginable to most. When they resumed their journey, they moved carefully, choosing paths that would lead them away from human settlements. Nahel was quiet, her eyes scanning the terrain with practiced ease. She had learned how to navigate the desert without drawing attention, and John trusted her judgment completely. By the time they reached a small creek that ran through a series of rock formations, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The air had cooled, and a gentle breeze stirred the dust. They stopped to drink from the creek, savoring the fresh water that had been so rare in their journey. As they sat by the water, the sounds of the desert began to shift. The birds had quieted, and the only noise was the soft rustling of the grass in the wind. John looked at Nahel, who was gazing at the water with a distant expression. "Do you ever think you'll go back?" he asked, his voice soft. Nahel shook her head slowly. "I don't know. I can't go back to what was, but I can find a new place, a place where I can live, where I don't have to hide." Her voice was steady, but John could hear the weight of her words. The past had shaped her, but it would not define her future. John nodded, understanding more than he could put into words. The past was important, but it didn't have to hold them prisoner. There was always a chance for a new beginning, a chance to forge ahead and create something different. As the stars began to appear in the sky above them, John and Nahel sat in silence. The desert had a way of bringing clarity, of making the noise of the world fall away. Here, in the stillness, there was a sense of peace. They were far from the house, far from the danger, and yet there was still uncertainty. The future was unknown, but in this moment there was only the quiet understanding between them, the shared experience of survival, of trust, and of the human spirit. John had come to the desert for solitude, but in the end, he had found something much deeper. He had found a connection, a bond forged in the fires of struggle and perseverance. And though they would part ways eventually, the memory of this time together would stay with them both forever. The desert had taught them that survival wasn't just about enduring the land. It was about enduring each other, about recognizing the strength in those who survive, and about the simple, quiet power of human connection. As they lay down to sleep under the stars, John couldn't help but feel grateful. For the first time in a long time, he knew that he had made a difference in someone's life. And in return, Nahel had changed his own, showing him